It was so awful. And I realized that if this was chronic, this could end my climbing career. Climbing and injuries are two things that seem to go hand in hand. I don't think I've met a climber who hasn't been injured, but equally, I know some climbers who are always injured and others who seem to get away with it more often than not. Now there's no doubt a load of explanations why this is. It could be overtraining, genetics, or just sheer bad luck. But the bottom line is, if we're trying hard, we can't escape it. Eventually, something happens and we just have to deal with it. For this video, I've scoured my brain and social media feed from over the years to compile a list of all my worst injuries through climbing. Now when I say worst, I don't mean like a little finger niggle that came and went between sessions. I mean things that stopped climbing for a month or more. And it's funny what the brain suppresses, because I've been climbing for 15 years, and it turns out I've had an injury in almost every other year of my life as a climber. And in some of those years, there were multiple injuries. So I'm going to go through every single one of them, talk about what the injury was, how I got injured, how I recovered, what mistakes I made, and at the end of all this, I'm going to finish with some words of wisdom from my many, many years as a climbing invalid. So let's take it back, right to the start, to the first injury I ever got. Flashback to 2005, I'm 15 years old, I've been climbing barely 6 months, and guess what? I want to be the best climber in the world. So every day after school, I'm at the wall, there till 10 p.m, till the second it shuts. All the climbing instructors and coaches are telling me, Robbie, calm down. You've got your whole life ahead of you. There's plenty of time to climb and train. Did I listen? Hell no. I just want to climb and climb hard. And then lo and behold, one day as I'm pulling over the lip of this roof, I feel my back go. My mum has to help me out of the wall as I'm hobbling, crippled over like an old man. It was the first time in my life that I ever got an injury. The first time I realized that I'm not invincible. And the first time something really disrupted the flow of this thing that I absolutely fell in love with, climbing. I never wanted to get injured ever again. But of course, I did.
This one was really only a badly pulled muscle in the back, so it only took a short time of around 3 to 4 weeks until I was back on the wall training. The cause was of course overtraining. In this example, long sessions of bouldering at close to max intensity with poor recovery between sessions. Youthful ignorance was to blame, and this short-term injury could have been avoided if I just had a bit more rest and practiced a quality over quantity approach to my hard bouldering sessions.
So interestingly enough, my next injury came many years later in 2012 during a bouldering competition. It was in the finals. I had my heel up on this little foothold. I was pulling on these little crimps, cranking on my heel, and as I rocked over and got my hips close into the wall, I felt this almighty crunch come from my knee. Of course, instantly I dropped off the wall and landed on the mats. I clasped my knee, and as I moved it, I could feel there was some pain. Turns out, it was an MCL tear, the medial collateral ligament in my knee. Now essentially, I've got very flexible hips and I can take a lot of the load from my fingers into my feet if I get my hips really close into the wall. But in this situation, I'd pushed the load so far through my knee that I hadn't quite realized my body's limitations and my knee had given way. As a result, it was at least 4 months off really hard climbing and a good amount of time rehabbing and repairing that knee.
A torn MCL is no joke and it really holds back climbing for a while. For me, it was around 4 months until I was completely back to normal. The cause of injury here was overload, different to overtraining as it can happen at any time and there isn't always a sign. As a result of this injury, I became aware of my body's limitations and it's allowed me to be more careful with these types of deep rockovers in future. Even if we are careful though, we can still get injured, and all you can really do is be aware of what you're doing and try to avoid any painful body positions.
And sometimes we get injuries we never expect. My next one was in 2014. I was trying the classic 8C sport climb Pata Negra in Rotator in Spain. The crux, right at the very end of the route, involves a really deep right drop knee. And as I was dropping the knee, going for the last hold, I heard that same crunch that I remembered from a couple of years ago during that bouldering competition. Of course, I instantly dropped off, taking a big fall and flying through the air. I lowered to the ground and I felt the pain come from the knee. I knew exactly what had happened, and I knew that within the next few hours it would swell up and I'd be in a lot of pain. So I did something incredibly stupid. I straightened my leg out, I taped it up so I couldn't bend it, and I got back on the climb and did it with one leg. Amazingly, I actually did do the climb, but it was possibly one of the most stupid things I've ever done. So what's the moral of that story? Sometimes injuries come when we don't expect them, and sometimes we do incredibly stupid things.
Fine, I'll never ever do another stupid thing.
4 to 6 weeks later.
Another torn MCL. Once again, it was an overload injury, but this time doing a drop knee as opposed to a rockover. Although I didn't use the leg on my successful ascent, it was a mistake to get back on the wall. I may have caused further injury and extended the recovery process. The recovery time this time was around 2 months, and I worked closely with a physio on my rehab.
For the next few years, I actually didn't get injured, but things were changing in my life and my life was becoming a lot more stressful. And it was in 2017 when I had my first physical and mental burnout. Now, burnout's a really strange thing. You know, it starts off being like this weird exhaustion and tiredness. It just comes over you like a wave. Like climbing became really hard. You know, just getting out of bed some days just felt like the hardest thing in the world. And I just felt I had this like brain fog so often. Now, I think it happens as a result of not changing your training load or the general intensity of your life when other aspects of your life are increasingly getting harder. You just kind of keep on an upward progression, never taking your foot off the accelerator. I mean, how do you avoid this? Because it's possibly one of the things I've struggled with most in my life. The truth is, I think you really need to administer just self-care a little every day. But it can be really hard to do, and believe me when I say this, I really struggle. I think one of the best things that you can possibly do is surround yourself with positive people who care for you, who can help you identify when you're going through these periods of higher intensity and help you manage the load of your training or workload effectively at these times.
Physical and mental burnout is a type of overload injury, but not something you'll feel in your muscles. It's more in the mind. It can last for as little as a week, but has lasted up to several months for me. It comes about because I struggle to say no to work or opportunities, and I just don't find it easy to relax. Talking to friends and family can help. Make them aware of your struggles, and perhaps they may notice when you're heading for a burnout, because as I've discovered the hard way, I am completely oblivious to it until it's too late.
So I had that pretty bad burnout in the spring of 2017. But after I got over that, it was in the summer of 2017, I was on an Alps trip and I was trying one of the Alpine trilogy. And the crux pitch, this 8B, had this gnarly 2-finger pocket, but my sausage fingers couldn't fit in there. So the only fingers I could fit in were my pinky and a little part of my ring finger. I'd shove them in the pocket, I'd lock down right at my hips and do this hard crossover. And on the red point go, I actually felt something go in my finger. I instantly knew I'd injured myself. I let go, I fell off, and I realized what I'd done. And I did something entirely stupid yet again. I taped it up and I went for it again. And this time I managed to get through, and luckily probably didn't do any more damage than I'd already done, although the jury's still out on that one. Essentially what happened here was I hadn't conditioned my body to dealing with this type of load. It's an interesting thing in climbing because I think climbers lead with their passion so often. I mean, how many times is it you've been on a climb, you've got to this one point and you have to pull on this gnarly little hold that something like you've never pulled on before, and you just do it anyway because that's what you got to do. I think the best thing we can do in these situations is try and prepare ourselves as best as possible for when these situations arise, especially if you're an outdoor climber who trains a lot indoors, because indoor climbing is just so friendly. And when you go outdoors and climb on rock, you're always grabbing things that are just a little bit tweaky. For me, if I had just trained a little bit on back two on the fingerboard, probably could have prevented myself from getting an injury there. Again, it's a hard one to foresee, but I think if we try and condition our bodies as well as possible for dealing with whatever comes when we are out climbing, it'll possibly help us avoid injuries in the long run.
This finger injury was a classic pulley tear in my ring finger as a result of an overload due to not being conditioned for the back two grip type, and climbing on it again after was not clever. A good lesson here is to be aware of the type of holds or moves you need to prepare for and condition yourself to be ready for them. For example, if you're going to go to Margalef, prepare for it with a bit of pocket conditioning on a fingerboard, as lots of climbers injure their fingers on first time intensive pocket pulling trips. Recovery time for this was about 2 months, but I was able to climb easier routes for the entire time and slowly build back up.
And then in 2018, during a Rocklands trip bouldering in South Africa, I injured my popliteal muscle, which is a muscle in the back of your knee. I did it on both legs, and it was from doing too many heel hooks. So Rocklands is quite three-dimensional climbing, and when you're as weak as me and you find it hard to pull on the holds, you just heel hook everything. So what is the lesson here? Try and avoid using technique to get over your weaknesses. What? No, I'm only joking. But you know what? It's possibly from doing too many of the same types of moves. Variety is the spice of life, as they say, and potentially in climbing, it might help avoid some injuries. So yeah, maybe try and avoid not doing the same moves over and over and over again.
The partial tear of a muscle in the Popliteal Fossa was caused by repeatedly trying hard boulder problems with intensive heel hooking. I could have avoided this by adding a bit more variety to my sessions, especially when I first noticed some pain caused by 1 or 2 initial heel hooks. Recovery time was about 3 months, but throughout the whole period I could still climb hard on vertical walls and slabs, and I just had to completely avoid heel hooks. I also worked closely with my physio on rehab and afterwards to strengthen the affected area for preventing more injuries.
And then in the winter of 2018, whilst I was winter climbing in Corrianlochan on the classic ventricle grade 7-8, that I shock loaded my shoulder when both my crampon points ripped on a ledge. I think it was my left, maybe my right, can't actually remember, shock loaded my left shoulder onto my rotator cuff, ripping it and putting me out of climbing for about 3 months.
So I've just led the crux pitch and I yanked my shoulder with my crampon, ripped out a foothold, and it's kind of sore now.
It was really annoying. It was purely from having pretty bad technique and pushing myself really hard on a climb. Now I've seen the same thing happen in rock climbing. You know, climbers with bad footwork, their feet rip, they shock load their arms and do the same injury. I had to take 3 months out of climbing, so I got into another sport, hill running, and I just went really hard at hill running for 3 months, and ironically ended up injuring my foot from bad technique. But by the time that happened, I was able to get back into climbing, so it was all good. So what is the moral of this story? Have better technique and learn from your mistakes.
This rotator cuff tear was an overload injury caused by the sudden shock load onto my shoulder due to my crampons ripping. The cause was poor technique. I could have just eased a little slower into the winter season that year. Recovery time was the longest I've had to deal with, around 4 months in total until full recovery, but 1 month of absolutely no climbing and 2 months of very easy climbing, then a month of slowly building back up. Throughout this, I worked closely with my physio, but also shifted focus to running to keep challenging myself. But I never learned from my first mistake though, and once again got injured.
And then it was in the autumn of 2019, whilst trying to climb Magic Mushroom on El Capitan, that I took a monstrous fall from the crux pitch on the Red Point push and injured my foot. It wasn't actually during the fall, it was actually whilst laybacking, going to the last hold of the climb, that I sprained a muscle in the top of my foot. Now I never actually thought that I'd ever injure my foot whilst climbing in such a way, but what I learned from this was just how much I used my feet, because honestly for about 6 months after that I couldn't use my left foot quite as well as I could prior to the injury, and it really debilitated my performance.
This was an overload injury caused by pushing my foot beyond an acceptable load. Although I could still climb with it, it took ages to get my foot back to full range without pain. Although there was many things that could have made an overload injury more likely, such as poor sleep, dehydration and many days of hard climbing in a row, these are just a reality of big wall climbing, and sometimes avoiding injury whilst climbing at your limit on a big wall comes down to just a bit of luck.
And then in 2020, I got possibly the scariest and worst injury I've ever had in my entire life. It started off as simply some tingling in my fingers, that when I threw my hand out of my bed, the tingling would disappear. But then when we went to Orkney to try the Long Hope, that tingling sensation became a burning pain that would come at night and stop me from sleeping entirely. I also noticed the tingling and numbness throughout the day when I was climbing, and it often manifested itself as white finger, like Raynaud's syndrome, in all my fingers, sometimes my entire hand. It was so awful, and I realized that if this was chronic, this could end my climbing career. I was really worried. I read up a lot on Google and online about like what it could be, but ultimately when I got back I went straight to my physio and to an osteopath, and what they recognized was that actually I had a lot of tenseness on the left side of my body. So with their help and with their help massaging and working on a few things, it started to get a bit better. But then I bought this one thing on the internet which just changed everything. Now guys, this is not an ad, trust me, but I absolutely love this product. It's called an arm aid and it allows you to massage your forearms really easily. And using this device, I could massage everything from my forearm next to my wrist all the way up to the upper forearm and then along the elbow. Now, I suspect that this injury was a result of nerve compression from over tight forearms, because after a good few weeks of working with the arm aid, the numbness left, the tingling left, the pain left, and even my Raynaud's syndrome disappeared. I mean, right now it's actually quite cold, and back those days, all my fingers would be white, and they're fine now. So yeah, I owe a lot to that arm aid. Trust me guys, if you've got this issue, definitely try it out.
The nerve compression was not officially identified, but I suspect it is the ulnar nerve, and in particular compressed at the elbow on the inner side of the joint between the forearm and bicep. Although it was exasperated by an intense trip to Orkney, this is a lifestyle-induced injury. I can't escape it because climbing is my life, so I need to learn to live with it and use methods to continuously relieve it. The fact that the Raynaud's almost entirely disappeared at the same time as I got rid of the pain from using the arm aid is a good sign that they were in some way connected. I think it's the nature of living that we will pick up lifestyle-related issues, whether that's sport-related or eating too many Big Macs. So long as we identify them early enough and act on this, we can keep on top of them.
And lastly, this takes us to 2021, my most recent injury. It was shortly after I did my project, What We Do in the Shadows, that I injured, I did a partial strain on the capsule joint in my left ring finger. And this did put me out of hard climbing for a good few months. But this was interesting because what it was a series of events that ultimately led to the injury and not one singular thing. You know, I'd spent a lot of time training for what we do in the shadows. I was traveling up and down the country, trying the project, training, living in my van, out of my normal routine. And then after I did the project, you know, the first mistake I made was not giving myself any time to relax or deload after such a stressful physical and mental ordeal. My second mistake was just starting on a new project almost immediately and going headfirst into a new training regime. And my third mistake was starting a completely new finger strength protocol, something I'd never tried before in my life, and going quite hard straight into it. You know, ultimately, it was these series of events that led to me ultimately straining this finger, and not any one thing in particular. You know, if we look back at all those little things, you know, if I'd just allowed myself some time to deload after training, or, you know, maybe gotten into that new finger strength protocol a little bit easier, you know, or maybe not jumped straight back onto a new project, I would have possibly avoided injury and been able to climb, you know, hard for a good few months. But in the end, I had to completely lay off hard climbing and take some time out.
This joint capsule strain was not caused by any single thing, but more a series of mistakes that led to an overuse injury. Although the recovery time was short at around 6 weeks, it did hold me back because I couldn't then prepare for my winter boulder project. Instead, I identified grip types that didn't hurt the finger, mainly open hand, and trained those instead. This flexibility meant I could still climb hard, and I focused more on explosive power rather than maximum finger strength. But the project will have to wait until next winter.
So my first piece of advice is to avoid injuries by using training as a means to prepare your body for the stresses we put on it in climbing. Don't just go on a trip to Margalef and pull on your first one finger pocket on day one. Perhaps put some dedicated time aside before the trip to condition your fingers to holding pockets. Secondly, avoid overtraining. I mean, that's an obvious one. And it can be hard sometimes to know when you're overtraining or not, but there are some simple markers to watch out for. Feeling tired often, having more consistently bad climbing sessions, even feeling tweaky like you might injure yourself. Bottom line, a day or two rest is better than a few months out of climbing. Thirdly, find yourself a good physio. They are worth their weight in gold. At the first sign of any injury, no matter how small, go and see them for a diagnosis and advice on rehab, or even preventative measures to avoid getting it worse or coming back in future. A good physio can be expensive, but it's worth every penny. And lastly, injuries aren't just physical, and the worst ones I've had have been mental, such as the burnout I spoke of. Climbing and life to a greater extent is an all-body activity, including your brain. Don't overdo it, and try and practice self-care a little every day. On that note, guys, I'm going to love yous and leave yous. Hope you enjoyed hearing about all my many ailments, and I hope this helps you guys avoid injuries and get more out of your climbing. As always, like, subscribe, and ding that wee bell for notifications on when the next video is out. And I'll catch you next time.